Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today for the DAMA Australia Sydney branch and PwC webinar, Navigating from Data Impediment to Data Enablement. My name is Varun Pant and I'll be your meeting host today. This event is part of the monthly series of meetings that we have at Sydney branch, but because of COVID-19, we all know that our regular meetings are on hold. But true to our mission of spreading knowledge around data management and data governance, we have with us today John from PwC to talk about data enablement. But first things first, before we commence the presentation, it is important to acknowledge that all of us, although united by technology, are physically on the lands of the traditional lands of Aboriginal people. We would like to pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. And the same respect is extended to all Indigenous people who are watching us from around this nation, or indeed the world. This is open to everyone who wants to attend. So before we get started, I would also like to introduce you to the DAMA team. We also have David Weeb, who is the president of DAMA Australia, who is in the panel, so you can see him. Myself, I'm the secretary of DAMA Australia and also the Sydney branch president. My name is Varun Pant. And the Sydney branch treasurer, Eric Leo, and Sydney branch events and marketing committee member, Mitzi Kent. So they were the ones who made it possible. So I am just speaking, but most of the work was done by Eric and Mitzi. You can also know about DAMA from our website, dama.org.au, and we would recommend that please follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter to get updates around data management. And of course, John, who has joined us from PwC, is a partner in PwC, and John leads PwC's data management and governance offering within PwC's digital trust practice. He specializes in assisting large and complex organizations realize their strategic and operational imperatives through data management. John brings almost 2 decades of local and global strategy to execution experience, spanning post-merger integrations, divestitures, enterprise scale startups, regularly change, customer experience, digital transformation, and cost out initiatives. You can name anything and he has done it. So through this session, we will explore some of the key ways in which data management is being used to solve a range of complex client challenges across a range of industries to enable organizations to overcome inaccurate, untimely, inconsistent executive and operational reporting, protect against data regulation breaches and cyber attacks, which is big thing in today's world, address excessive spend resulting in point solutions and untrusted data silos, and many other challenges. So what we will do is John will take over and he will present. And after that, you can ask questions via the chat function, and the audience can also vote on those. And at the end, John will address most of the questions as the time permits. And also please note that the session will be recorded and available on the DAMA Australia website to DAMA members. So without much ado, over to John. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction there, Varun, and thank you very much to DAMA for the opportunity to come and speak to everybody here today.
Thank you.
Before we actually get into today's discussion topic, I thought it might be good to set the scene and let you know a little bit about our organisation and what we do and how we help. So broadly speaking, our data governance and management capability is a national capability. We assist across all states of Australia and multiple industries, including financial services, state and federal government agencies, logistics and transport, health and utilities and mining, just to name a few. We've got a national team of 150 plus data and analytics specialists here in Australia, but globally we've got over 27,000 people who've been trained in data analysis and reporting. We also have 3 global delivery centres based out of Bangalore, Calcutta and Manila in the Philippines that can help us augment our local capability in order to help organisations with the pace and scale of the challenges that they're facing into. that's enough about us, and let's get on to today's topic. So we're here to talk about getting from data impediment to data enablement. But before we get to that headline topic, the first thing that we're going to do is introduce the concept of digital trust. From there, we're going to talk about building the business case for doing data well within organisations. And then we'll move on to actually explaining how we navigate from data impediment to data enablement. As Varun has highlighted, we'll have time throughout the session. If you want to log questions as you go through, there's an opportunity to vote and promote questions to the top. And there'll be a couple of checkpoints between each of these topics where we can address any of the questions that may have been raised. Or alternatively, we can get towards the end of the session, and if we've got time permitting, we'll answer some of the questions at that point in time. So, what is digital trust? Digital trust is about having a holistic approach to ensuring that an organisation's digital assets are protected and delivering value. So many organisations that we deal with mobilise data governance and management purely around data analytics and data warehouse initiatives. When we work with boards and C-suite executives, we seek to ensure that the data is being appreciated as an enterprise asset with the right level of organisation and that it's delivering on core business value. As such, when we approach data governance and management within organisations, we look at it through a number of different facets and lenses. We need to make sure that it's aligned to the organisation's strategy, but we also need to make sure that we're addressing the most impending BAU issues and risks that are surfacing through the organisation. And we need to make sure that not only is data trusted and fit for purpose, that it's protected from misuse, that it's delivering value, but we need to make sure that the technology that is actually managing organisations' data is aligned to business needs so that point solutions and shadow IT or end user computing isn't popping up to manage deficiencies in technology, but also that there's the right level of resilience to deal with disruption and volatility. There's no greater example of how organisations have had to deal with a significant technology change through COVID-19 and adapt rapidly to how they manage their data, including all of the privacy and data protection implications associated with that. But last but not least, we need to make sure that we're looking at data management from a cyber protection perspective as well. Moving to a distributed work environment, such as what we're doing under COVID-19, increases the interest and volatility around cyber attacks. And we've seen that pop up a number of times in recent months, whether it's major logistics organisations or FMCG organisations or different government sectors. We've seen a lot of that being publicly announced through the media of late as well. So when we talk about data and data governance and management, we need to make sure that we look at it through this holistic perspective. So what do we mean looking at it through this holistic perspective? We need to make sure that there's a systematic and formalised approach. So we start off by making sure that the right strategic intent is set up within organisations. If you look at any organisation out there, there will most likely be a strategic plan or a strategy for the next 3 to 5 years. To what extent is data and technology and cyber supporting the realisation of those strategic ambitions? And how is that going to be mobilised in the form of a roadmap or detailed plan? We then need to make sure that the right tools and capabilities are in place and the right resources are mobilised to deliver on that roadmap. Data is often considered an add-on to people's day jobs, but there's an imminent need to make sure that there's the right level of resourcing within the organisation focused on uplifting and protecting their data. Finally, we can't just assume that when projects come through and they deliver on what was planned in the roadmaps, that it's going to stick. So we need the right controls and assurance mechanisms in place within organisations to make sure that if there are standards and policies that have been established and put in place, and that data has been uplifted to an acceptable level, that it's being continuously monitored and that non-compliance to those standards is being dealt with so that the organisation doesn't deteriorate. So, what is the case for doing data well? Many of you may know, or some of you may not know, but in 2019, PwC pushed out some thought leadership to the market titled Data Done Well. Now, we've got a relatively large audience today, and many of the concepts that may have been introduced in this paper may not be new to you. But part of what we need to do is make sure that we're educating not only the data professionals within our organisations, but business, executives, technology and risk professionals all need to be aligned around the common concepts and standards around what we should be facing into. So if last year was setting out the agenda of how do we lead organisations to strike the balance between a data-driven value creation and data governance, in this year, 2020, with COVID-19, it's about demystifying the roadmap of how to get from data impediments to data enablement. So the first portion of today's session is going to talk about the real drivers and the need to act. And then the second portion of today's session is going to talk about what are some of the common patterns and ways that organisations can mobilise around their data in order to achieve those outcomes. So, what are some of the drivers for the need for good data management? New technologies are increasing the scale and complexity of data with organisations. No matter where we look within organisations and society today, digital transformation is upon us. COVID-19 alone has seen the drive of retail industries from bricks and mortar to pure play digital players. We're seeing automation taking the place of people in back offices throughout organisations. For years and years, we've had people being the stopgap between systems within organisations, swivel chairing and dealing with deficiencies in logic that are sitting within systems. So we need to make sure that we're managing those challenges. We've seen the rise of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And as we seek to automate our organisations and use sophisticated algorithms to identify value and deliver differentiated experiences, we introduce risk that if those well-automated processes are fed with flawed or biased data, that the wrong outcome will come from the right process. We've seen the rise of data predators. We talked earlier around the risks of cyber threats, ransomware, and the dark web. No longer is the question just about how do I protect myself from attempted attacks. We need to be in a position to respond when we've been attacked. How do we know what data is being accessed? How do we know what data is being compromised? Which of our customers and stakeholders and regulators do we need to inform? And how do we know that if we haven't understood the organisational data of what is sitting where within our enterprise? Many of you will be very familiar with Cambridge Analytica. This is not new news, but if you go back 5 or 10 years ago, the level of sophistication around awareness in the public of what privacy is and what can be done with your private data was not well known. We now have a very good appreciation of how organisations can leverage our behaviours to tailor advertising to sway our opinions and ultimately drive very large-scale changes in society. And add to this, we've got the introduction of concepts such as the consumer data right and open banking, which are looking to revolutionise the way that our data is shared across organisations and need explicit controls in place around consent, data anonymisation, and data destruction. Scrutiny and regulation is rising. Now, I could have an encyclopedia of legislation that's coming up in various industries, government, private sectors, and globally. But here's just a couple of those. We've obviously got the GDPR coming out of Europe. We've got the California Consumer Privacy Act. Now, these are global legislations. One might ask, well, what does that mean to us? Well, if our organisations are moving to become pure play digital players and our customer bases are in those regions, we need to understand our obligations in order to ensure that we remain compliant. And these legislations introduce significant financial penalties if we don't get it right. We've got the introduction of the consumer data right, including the evolving need to make sure that you're in a position to explain what data you're holding about individuals and organisations, and destroying that when that data is no longer being used or needed to be used in line with the consent that's been provided. We've seen the massive rise in executive accountability regimes. What we're talking about here is that for a long time, data and systems within organisations have been considered complex and doing things that haven't necessarily had the transparency to the highest levels. We're now seeing boards and senior executives being held accountable for where data is not being used correctly and the wrong outcomes are impacting individuals in society. We've seen the introduction, or are seeing the introduction of legislation around data sharing and release. We need to make sure that data is democratized across organisations and government, but we need to protect privacy at the same time and ensure that the right people are getting access to the right data and that it's of the right quality for them to use that for their intended purposes. And last but not least, we've got a large range of banking regulations which are progressively being rolled out, including CPS 234, which is about data security, CPG 235, which is about data risk management, and BCBS 239, which is about the good practices around data risk aggregation. These are not easy obligations for organisations to implement against, particularly when there's a significantly complex data debt or technology debt scenario where there's hundreds, if not thousands, of systems which are managing data within organisations. This all leads to the outcome that stakeholders are expecting that their data will be kept safe. Whether that stakeholder is regulators through the introduction of legislation with real-world financial penalties, if not imprisonment for breaching some of these rules and regulations. We've got third parties and supply chains. We're no longer just organisations in our own right. We've got extended ecosystems with digital footprints. Our data is being moved from inside of our premises into the cloud, and we're increasingly reliant on third-party vendors in order to deliver against our objectives. One of the key challenges in this space is that we have standards within our own organisations around how data needs to be managed, but how do we keep our third parties and our supply chains to account in the way that they manage and use our data? This is an evolving space and is progressively being legislated on also. Finally, as we touched on before, consumers are starting to make sure that their rights are being understood. And there's a very, very delicate balance between being cool and being on the creepy side of cool as to what you can do with data, particularly when you start to move into the world of AI and machine learning. And we need to make sure that the concepts of data ethics are in place, and we're only using data in a way that we're comfortable that our consumers would not would be at ease with. Add to all of this that the data quality challenges that organisations are facing into is getting more complex. As I mentioned before, we're moving the data into the cloud, and we don't necessarily have access to the underlying data that's sitting within each of these systems. We need to make sure that the right mechanisms are in place to be able to, so I'm not sure what happened there, let me go back. to be able to access that data and ensure its consistency across the many different flavors of clouds and platforms that we have in place. We're dealing with significant technology debt from historical decisions. And as we go on our digital transformations, we need to actually not only focus on where our data is going to be in the future state and where it's coming from in the legacy estate, but for long periods of time, we're going to need to straddle both of those worlds. Finally, it's only now that we're starting to get a true appreciation of how much critical business data is actually not even stored in our official IT platforms. We've got significant business managed IT platforms and end user computing, which is proliferating across our organizations, whether it's in the form of Access databases, Excel spreadsheets, or even cloud-based platforms that have been spun up off the back of corporate credit cards. So how do we manage all of these challenges? How do we deploy a data governance framework that's fit for purpose and ensures that we're actually set up for success? 6 key areas to make sure that you've got the right controls in place and the right focus include making sure you've got a focus on monetization. Now, historically, when we've talked about monetization, we've talked about it in the concepts of how do we actually sell data. But we need to extend the concept of monetization to understand what is the value of getting data right compared to the value of getting data wrong. And if we can reduce cost or increase efficiency or increase customer experience within the organization, these are all ways to demonstrate the value of good data management. As I touched on before, we need to introduce the concept of data ethics into our data governance and management frameworks to make sure that how data is proposed to be used is in line with what the organisation and its consumers and its regulators is comfortable with. We need to make sure that we've actually got sustainable data quality mechanisms in place within organisations to ensure that data is fit for use. Now, when I say data quality mechanisms, I'm not talking about having data quality dashboards. I'm talking about ensuring that we've got a systematic and formalised process to be able to actually analyse our most critical data, ensure that it's fit for purpose. If it's not fit for purpose, put the investment in remediation to bring it up to the required level of quality, but then also embed the controls into the organisation to ensure that that data remains fit for purpose going forward and we don't have the same issues re-eventuating time and time again. We need to make sure that privacy is clearly understood. And privacy is not just about understanding, do we have our date of birth, do we have a customer's location, or do we have some sensitive information around it? It's also about making sure that what we've got the consent for to use that data for, it's aligned with our data use governance practices as well. Furthermore, we need to make sure that our data is secure. We can't just assume that if we've got role-based access in place on our key systems, that our data within our organisation is safe, particularly in a world where we've historically had a really high use of business managed IT or Excel spreadsheets or informal solutions where data is proliferated across the organisations on SharePoint drives, on file servers, through email. We need to make sure we've got a holistic approach in place that looks at where we've got our data and we've got the right controls in place to make sure that only the right people have access to the data that they need to do their jobs. And last but not least, we need to make sure that we've got a focus on compliance. How are we going to enforce that if we've got policies and standards around how we're going to manage our data, that it is actually being managed in accordance with that? And this often means ensuring that we're aware of where there is non-compliance and that it can be okay that we're non-compliant if we've got exemptions. This is a key area where this has started to surface in recent times, is a lot of the historical policies around sharing of data are actually need to be exempt in the context of COVID-19, where there are new use cases and imminent needs to share potentially sensitive data across government entities, which may historically have been outside of policy boundaries. So a couple of key questions for you to consider when you're reflecting on your own organisations. Do you have a data strategy? And if you do, what do you mean by do you have a data strategy? Is it actually tied to the corporate objectives and corporate plan of the organisation, making sure that the organisation's most critical data is protected, fit for purpose, sufficient that your strategic imperatives will actually be safeguarded? Are you clear on your stakeholders and regulator expectations? Is the business case for governing your data clear? And do you have a systematic and formalised approach in order to deploy that framework? Finally, do you have your compliance and incident management processes in place, particularly in the world that we're facing into, where we've got significant exposure to privacy breaches and to cyber threats? For many organisations, it's not a case of if something will happen, it's a case of when it will happen and how well will you be prepared in order to respond in a timely and reliable way, sufficient that you can protect your brand. All right, so that takes us to the end of the first section, which is about understanding the business case for doing data well. Run, do we have any questions that have been lodged at this point in time, or should we proceed straight through into moving from data impediment to enablement?
Yeah, there is a couple of questions. Ashish has asked a question. Before I ask the question to you, guys, you can actually click on the Q&A at the bottom, and then you can ask questions there as well so that other people can vote on it. But otherwise, you know, even if you're asking it on the chat, that's fine, absolutely fine. So Ashish is asking that APRA caught most of the Australian banks off guard recently when asked to provide top 100 CRDE in line with the BCBS 239 regulation and implement CPG 235. How to approach in implementing such practices in large landscape organizations such as the Big Four banks?
Yeah, look, that's a really great question. And now I'm going to test my memory. I think it was in about April last year that APRA approached the major banks in Australia and asked them to firstly identify what are the 100 most critical risk data elements for their own organisations. Now, this is admittedly different for each organisation based on the technology that they've deployed and the complexity in order to prepare their risk reporting. But not only did they ask them to identify what were the 100 most critical risk data elements, they asked them to do a number of things. One, they needed to understand what was the lineage of that data through the organisation. So if you had a critical data element that appeared on a report, how did that get derived from all of the information collected and managed across the organisation? In a number of situations, that can involve 20 plus steps to get it from a core system through various data integration, data hubs, data warehouses, through various analytical models and onto regulatory reports. So demystifying that in its own right can be a complicated activity. The second thing that they asked them to do was make sure that they've got confidence that as that data has gone from system to system to system through reports and analytical models, how are they confident that the data is still of high integrity and it hasn't degraded, so that it's sufficient that the data that's represented in that end report is correct and fit for purpose. And then thirdly, if they weren't confident that that data was of high integrity, what improvements do they need to put in place to remediate that over time? So it's as highlighted by Ashish, it wasn't an easy ask, and it's something which is taking many of the banks quite a significant amount of effort and time to address. I guess what I would highlight to you, Ashish, is that this is central to what we're talking about today. So when we talk about value, we talk about understanding what is the most important data for an organization and how do we make sure that that data is fit for purpose. So we should, in an ideal world, not be reliant on a regulator coming to ask us to do this. And in fact, I won't name the individual banks, but I know of banks that were already ahead of the curve in terms of their thinking that they need to move away from their legacy data wrangling towards strategic data solutioning and implementing enterprise data hubs. And as part of that, they'd already commenced on the journey, whereas others were caught in a bit more of a reactive standpoint. So it's not an easy task. Most organizations are working through it, but what it's also doing is actually raising the importance of the agenda within organizations and the need to understand what our most critical data is. And it might not only be risk. This has just been driven from APRA because it is risk related, but there can be critical data related to customer experience. There can be critical data related to profitability. How do we know what our most critical data is within an organization, and how are we investing to make sure that that data is of the right quality and available to the right people in the right timeframes to manage our businesses through this really volatile environment?
Thanks, John. There's another question from Pascal Stendel. So he's asking, from the time Australian governments moved to the cloud, they ignored the fact that data could be held on foreign servers subject to foreign laws. How can you expect and trust that government data held on Australian taxpayers will be protected on foreign soil? So it's about data sovereignty, and is there evidence that organizations are moving to clouds held on Australian servers?
Look, this is it's a great question. Thank you, and it's you're picking up on some of the key themes that we're talking about in the presentation. So that's great that you've taken a specific use case. So what we typically advocate is making sure that no matter what the projects are within organisations, that we extend the concepts that have been founded over the recent decades around privacy. So most organisations right now have got to the level of maturity where they have implemented what's known as a privacy impact assessment in their project delivery and change management methodology, so that when you go about doing a strategic initiative, you actually have a checkpoint to assess what are our obligations in how we manage our data. We advocate for the introduction of a data impact assessment in those methodologies to make sure that as they go through, they're not only looking at it from a privacy perspective, we're looking at it from an ethical perspective, we're looking at it from a data integrity perspective, and that we have the right controls in place and the right checkpoints in place to explicitly accept any decisions that we're making around data sovereignty. Now, I will note that I'm aware that there is actually a very significant focus in many government organisations around data sovereignty, and they're critically aware of the risks associated with data sharing across regional boundaries and even data sharing within government agencies. So there is something called the 5 Safes framework, which might be worth having a look at, which is being embedded in the data sharing and release legislation that's forthcoming. But I love the sentiment behind the question, and it really credentializes the need to make sure that we're looking at data management more than just from a data quality perspective, but also covering off the data privacy and data security angles as well.
John, just quick, sorry if I just butt in here quickly on that one. Definitely this whole idea that the government is expecting sovereignty, and based on my experience too, that guarantees from cloud service providers now have to be in place to keep that data on the soil. So it wasn't so much a privacy issue, it was this whole idea about if your service provider is owned by a non-Australian national, like a Yank or something, then they headquarters could all of a sudden say, show me what's in that cloud. And that was the whole the whole purpose. So I think it's more of that security angle more so than privacy.
Yeah, spot on, David. I guess what I was trying to highlight is making sure the equivalent of the privacy checkpoints, we need to have the data security and data risk management checkpoints in our methodologies as well. And one thing that I'll highlight as well is the introduction of CPS 234, which is a financial services legislation around data security, making sure that our vendors and supply chains are managing our data in accordance with our policies and standards. We frequently, the nature of our business is we frequently deal with our clients' data, and we often get asked, how are we managing the data that we're collecting? How do we evidence that the data is actually being kept onshore and that we are not we're not violating any of our clients' rules around data sovereignty? So it's something that's a fast evolving space, but we've definitely, as a society and as an industry, we've definitely got a lot of room for improvement in the space.
Thanks, John. And I can definitely relate to everything that you're saying. I'm working in eHealth at the moment, eHealth New South Wales. So, someone asked, what is the I think it is Pascal who asked, what is the 5 safes framework? So it is essentially, we use it at eHealth for ascertaining the risks involved when you're sharing some data for secondary use with, for example, for research, right? So we look at the safe projects. Is the use of the data appropriate? Safe people, can the users be trusted to use it in an appropriate manner? Safe data. Is there a disclosure risk in the data itself? Safe settings. Does the access facility prevent unauthorized use? So this will cover a lot of your data sovereignty things as well. And most of the times the environment is in a virtualized environment where you can do research on the data, but you can't take it out. So you can't export it. And safe outputs. So are the statistical results non-disclosive? And we have to make sure that the results as they're presented are, although they are independent, but we do a final check to minimize the risk when releasing the findings of the project. Thank you.
Look, I'll just answer one last question, which at this point, maybe I think we're tending to answer the questions in chat. So I'm just wondering, Varun, if we want to try and standardise that so we make sure that all the key questions do get asked. But I'll answer this last one from David. Where does PwC suggest that their clients record key or critical data within the organisation? So I think this is a fantastic question. So we've seen it's across industry. So in financial services, we have CPS 234, which mandates an organisation have an information asset register, which identifies what their most critical data is from a sensitivity perspective, from an integrity perspective, and from an availability perspective. In Victoria, we have some state legislation which actually also mandates, it's called VPDSS or VPDSF, which also mandates that organisations have an information asset register, very much aligned to what's stated in financial services as well. So that's driven from a data security perspective. But one thing that's really interesting is as you go through and classify and rank your data by its criticality, you've got that criticality through those 3 lenses. You've got that sensitivity lens, which is really talking about from that perspective of privacy and confidentiality, if that data was to be compromised. You've got the integrity angle, which makes sure that if that data is not timely, accurate, and fit for purpose, how it can compromise an organisation's business processes. And then you've got the availability perspective of what's the importance of each of those data sets and assets if that data was to be compromised or unavailable, which we would see typically through a BCP type scenario. So from a data set perspective, that's a great anchor, and then you've got the opportunity to kind of cascade that down, and a lot of organisations are leveraging platforms such as Calibra or Informatica, or there's a whole suite of different data governance platforms which can then start to track business definitions and criticality at that lower level. So I hope that answers that question for now, and maybe we'll save the questions which are in the formal Q&A to be picked up a little bit further in the presentation.
Yeah, and a message to all attendees, please do use the formal Q&A so that people can vote on it, because otherwise we won't be able to run through the whole presentation. So please post your questions in the Q&A section. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. So now I think we're all on the same page around how important it is to do data well within an organization. When we talk to clients, one of the common things that I see is that we get asked to mobilize data governance, but it typically gets mobilized, or the ask very commonly comes from the implementation of a bit of new tech, whether that new tech is a data lake, or it's the implementation of a data warehouse, or potentially an ERP platform or something within the organization. But it's very common for it to be a system-driven trigger. And we then see organizations picking up the great work behind DM Block or an equivalent body of knowledge. There's a few out there, and looking at all the competencies that need to be put in place. But the question is, or the question that I ask is, how are we anchoring it onto the strategic priorities of the organisation, and are we looking at it holistically for organisations? So rather than looking at it from an inside-out perspective, encourage organisations to look at it from an outside-in perspective. Boards and executives need to make sure that they've got the timely and accurate data to navigate their organisations through the turbulent times that we're in. Risk professionals need confidence that data is being managed and protected in line with customer and regulatory obligations. And that's not just the data in our data lakes, data warehouses, or reporting systems. That's the data that we've got regardless of wherever it sits, if it's in our ERPs, in our CRMs, or if it's in emails, land drives, Excel spreadsheets, you name it. Wherever we've got our sensitive and confidential data, we need to make sure that it is secured. We've then got finance and operational executives who are dealing with the legacy of data wrangling, and they've got numerous conflicting sources of truth. And we need to prioritize which business functions need what data, and how can we optimize that to get the best, most efficient outcome, particularly if we're trying to go down the path of leveraging technologies like RPA and automation, because we don't necessarily want to automate data wrangling. We need to optimize the way that we manage and deliver our data so that we're comfortable that each of the different functions of the organization have access to timely and consistent data, so that if you deal with one division, you don't get a different experience and outcome compared to when you deal with another division. And finally, transformations are evolving as an incredibly important area to make sure that data governance and management is front and center. Very common in the discussions and experiences I've got with working with our clients, that transformation programs are mobilized as greenfield initiatives or blue sky initiatives, where organizations seek to reinvent themselves and free themselves from the shackles of all of the legacy technology debt that's in place within the organizations. And I'm an avid supporter of the aspiration. But one thing that I typically see that takes place is that when they do that, they don't necessarily make sure that the data that they're going to put into these new target systems is fit for purpose. And the methodologies and SDLCs don't have formal data sourcing requirements, data profiling and quality assurance, and appropriate reconciliations and testing to make sure that the new systems will operate effectively on the legacy data, as well as making sure that they've got plans in place to deal with the many different transient states that they're going to go through before they actually get to their end state. So it's often greatly underappreciated, the complexity of managing data in the context of a large-scale business transformation or digitisation agenda. So what we are trying to introduce here is the focus on getting organisations to understand and look at themselves from a perspective of, are we dealing with the impediments that we've got right now? Are we investing our data management effort in tactically firefighting, or are we strategically leaning into optimising the way that we govern and manage data within our organisations? If we look at the left-hand side, and I'll go through some of these, many of you will probably be able to relate these to specific instances and challenges within your own organisations. So we've got executives and operational functions dealing with inaccurate or untimely or inconsistent data. And that can result in executives going into rooms trying to make key decisions, but ending up debating the data instead of being in a position to make decisions. We've got scenarios where organisations are being compromised through cyber or ransomware attacks, and they don't know what data's been compromised, and they don't have the processes in place to deal with the scenario that they're entered, and they're constantly scrambling to figure out how to manage the situation. We've got large and complex organisations that don't have just one data warehouse or data lake, they have 2, 3, 4, not to mention the various SQL servers and tactical solutions that have been stood up under desks within organisations, creating untrusted data silos. And there's constant reconciliations trying to justify what is right and what is wrong. We've got large numbers of projects which are taking significantly longer than originally anticipated, and delivering significantly less scope than originally anticipated due to the complexity associated with legacy data challenges. And we've got double handling, rework and manual errors resulting in quantifiable cost to the organisation. On the other side of the fence, if we get data right, if we focus on data offense instead of data defense, then we're asking the question of, how do we actually improve the agility and oversight of the organisation? How do we actually put the right controls in place to protect privacy and ensure that we're resilient through turbulent times, and ensure that our regulators have trust in our organisation and we're not just responding to constant requests? How do we actually get a better return on investment on our data spend? And how do we de-risk our digital and data-centric transformations? And how do we optimise and automate our processes within our organisation through high-quality data to reduce inefficiency and waste? So what we'll do is step through each of these and focus on the offensive side. And what we'll talk about very briefly is where we see organisations typically facing into from a data defence perspective, and then how can you change the game and look at it from a data offensive perspective. Because depending on whether you're playing defence or playing offence, you have a different scope, you have a different tooling and technology requirements, and you have a different resource pool and way to invest in your organisation. So if we're talking about improving agility and oversight, as I mentioned before, the typical scenario if you're playing in this space is there's a lot of manual data wrangling. We might have board reports or exec reporting that can take days, if not weeks of manual effort to collect data across the organisation. There's a constant focus on reconciling data across sources to make sure that when we put those reports on the table, we're confident that it's right and we're not going to end up in a situation where we've made the wrong decision. Where we've got a lot of issues with conflicting reports that are coming from different areas across the organisation, causing debates. And we're doing a lot of justification and exception-based reconciliations based on the information that's been tabled. And what's really common is when that happens, you don't have the underlying data available to you to actually answer the business questions that are being surfaced. So how do we take an offensive approach around this? Well, the first thing we need to do is actually understand what is that key data or key information that is critical to our organisation in order to be successful and agile. How do we know that we're actually doing it right? You know, KPIs for a data management program shouldn't be about how many reports have we automated, but focus more on the benefits that we're targeting by surfacing that data at a higher quality in a more timely fashion, and making sure that the people who need that data have access to it. How do we understand and prioritise what data needs to be sourced from where across the organisation, and which portions of our data architecture need to be optimised around data lineage? And how do we actually proactively profile and assess the quality of data and uplift it to make sure that when we do produce this reporting, we're not having to adjust the symptom, but we're correcting it at the source? That naturally leads us to the question of how do we optimise the way that we source and curate data across the organisation, including the removal of unnecessary human processes? And how do we surface self-service, drillable reporting so that when we do get these key questions being asked by our executives, there's access to that underlying data in order to make sure that we're confident that we understand why the business has moved or performed in a certain way. And this theme almost talks back to the BCBS angle as well. Whilst this is framed around executive reporting, ultimately we're trying to get to the point of making sure that when you've got data that's actually represented in regulatory reports, it's explainable, and that we've got the right infrastructure and practices in place within our organisation to make sure that that is the case. If we're talking about data protection and sharing and operational resilience, we're talking about reducing the risk and increasing the responsiveness to when these events occur. What we typically find is organisations in crisis management or issue management scenarios, there's a constant focus on trying to explain, well, how did that happen? Why did we get into that situation? There's a tactical focus on threat scanning and understanding, is this going to happen again? What do we need to change? How can we potentially reduce the risk in the short term? And then there's the focus on impact assessments and remediation around the compromised information assets. That's a tremendous amount of effort that an organisation can get caught up into. If the organisation has the opportunity to proactively face into these before it is an issue, then we repurpose that effort on enablement activities to ensure that they're well positioned if and when these challenges occur. So what are those key focuses from a data management and governance perspective? First of all, we need to have a catalogue of our information asset registers. I talked about that from the VPDSS perspectives. I talked about it from a CPS 234 perspective, but it's just good practice. How can we govern our data if we don't actually understand what data we've got and how it's used within our organisations? Not just from a reporting perspective, but from a process perspective. What data is critical to what process within the organisation, and why do we collect it? How do we store it? And how do we make sure, therefore, that it is secure and that it is fit for purpose in line with its relative criticality? That ultimately leads us into establishing the policies and standards, and that those policies and standards are aligned to the criticality of that data and the requirements of regulations. That enables us to then develop data governance frameworks and operating models around how do we make sure that those policies and standards are in place, and embedding them through SDLCs or system development life cycles, stage gating, and control mechanisms such as internal audit or compliance. We can take it a step further though, and implement platforms around data loss prevention based around the most critical and sensitive data, and ensure that we've got active monitoring in place to ensure that there is policy compliance. So hopefully you can see that, you know, if we invest the time up front here, that if and when these threats eventuate, we're in a much better position to be able to respond. All right, let's talk about increasing return on data spend. Now, I won't name any individual clients, but I was working with a very large and complex financial services organisation. And no matter where you looked within that organisation, they had a challenge that if you're looking in the risk space, the risk capability had their own data warehouses, data lakes and solutions. If you looked in the retail part of the organisation, they had their own solutions, institutional, their own solutions, and various other supporting functions such as regulatory reporting and finance had their own solutions as well. Now, ultimately, that meant that we had duplicates of data proliferating across the organisation. And that results in inconsistent data handling, and that also then results in inconsistent reporting, and therefore it leads back to that agility and trust and confidence question around when we're dealing with our end products, how do we have confidence that they're fit for purpose? They've historically gone and bought new tech time and time again, thinking that the new latest and greatest might solve our problem. So they had Teradata, they had Cloudera, they had a number of SQL Server and other different point solutions that have been put in place. And so we knew that just buying a new platform is not going to be a solution. So strategically, we needed to understand, well, where is the organisation investing? What are they trying to achieve from an outcome perspective? And how can we make sure that when they're delivering those programs, through their delivery roadmaps, they're actually starting to progressively align with their enterprise data architecture or target data architecture, and making the siloed investment incrementally adopt the technology within the organisation. Then you can make sure you've got the right control frameworks within the organisation. In this specific instance, we're talking about making sure that when you allocate funding to your strategic investments across the organisation, there's checkpoints that funding is going to directly, incrementally adopt the preferred technologies and standards, and then implementing tracking capabilities to ensure that they're progressively making the difference that they need to make from that perspective. So through having a focused approach on return on investment, they don't need to go and say, hey, we need another X $100 million to put in a new data lake. They actually leverage their existing investment slate and business-led investments to deliver the technology through projects. De-risking digital transformation and data-centric transformation. As I alluded to before, it's not uncommon for organisations to reach out to organisations such as ourselves when they are midway through a large-scale transformation and there's been significant challenges and issues because of delays and non-realisation of value and significant investment. And where they typically get caught up is doing, again, the health checks of what went wrong on the project, how do they have confidence that the data that's partially in the new systems is consistent with the data that's in all their legacy platforms, and how do they implement tactical solutions reporting, and how do they implement tactical data cleansing just to keep everything progressively going. And if they get stuck in this space, they can continue to throw good money after bad and not change the game that they're playing, so that future releases on those transformation programs can tend to have the same challenges. So what we advocate in this instance is looking at implementing a data risk framework. What do I mean by a data risk framework? I'm talking about understanding what functionality and what business processes you're trying to implement within your organization, explicitly identifying what data is going to be critical to those processes and outcomes, and then proactively going out and ensuring that that data, legacy data ecosystem is well understood, and that the data within that ecosystem is fit for purpose for the proposed functionality that's being built in the target platform. And if it's not, using this early checking of data to iterate that functional design and or uplift that data in the legacy estate sufficient such that when you get to functional testing and reconciliations and go lives, you're not getting that late landing understanding of all of those data quality problems when it's too late for the project to fix it. So it's really pushing the data awareness right up the SDLC lifecycle and making sure there are clear checkpoints and responsibilities throughout that methodology. Whoops. And finally, if we're talking about reducing inefficiency and waste, we've got a constant focus within organisations doing what we refer to data wrangling, and people are just making do with pulling data from here to there or putting it into Access databases or Excel spreadsheets or other solutions just to work around where the data sits and what's available to them to get the job. So if we're focusing on this, the first thing we want to do is make sure that we catalog what we're trying to achieve, and we can leverage our information asset registers that we talked about from a security and privacy perspective before to identify the most critical data and processes in our organization. We then need to make sure, well, what data needs to be consistently managed across processes in the organization, and put a targeted reference data management and master data management framework in place. And what I'm talking about here is reference and master data management, not reference and master data management platforms. The focus of what I'm talking about here is making sure that consistent data is being used, whether it's customer data, whether it's product data, whether it's location data. If we don't have those consistency in processes, what we find is that as you go across the value chain of an organization, your data might be fit for your step, but 2 steps down across the organization, the processes start to break because the data is inconsistent with what they need in their systems. Therefore, there needs to be a focus on data quality management, and we're talking about proactive data quality management here and making sure that data is fit for the processes and uplifting it, standardizing those processes, and then leveraging automation to reduce inefficient and duplicate handling of data. If we try and do this too soon, all we're doing is automating our tactical fixes, and we still have the proliferation of distrust in our data across the organization. All right, that pretty much brings us to the end of the discussion that we had planned for today, and we've now got time for some additional questions. So, Varun, how are we looking from a Q&A perspective?
Thanks, John. That was really, really good and really, really interesting. And, you know, as evidenced by the number of questions that had come across. So David and I have answered a few. You know, we didn't want to answer it on your behalf, but some of the things we have to prioritize, right? So we don't want things to get missed out. So there's still 7 questions which are open, but you know, depending on your availability and time, we would take top 5 questions. Yeah, you're fine with 5, or you want to answer all 7?
No, I'll take what have we got. What was our official finish time for today?
So look, it's 1 hour from the beginning, plus we keep 10-15 minutes for questions. So
we hit them with as many as we can.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Look, I'm good to go. So let's face into the questions.
Yeah, let's go with all the questions. Okay. So first question from Will: John, you mentioned the importance of having a data strategy that is aligned with the organizational or business strategy. It seems that business strategies normally run for 3 to 5 years. Does that imply we need to review and update the data strategy in step with the organizational strategy?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question, Will. So the way that I typically answer this question is that you look at the mechanics of the way that organizations typically manage their investment slate. So organizations set a business strategy. To your point, they usually have a number of horizons or years in which they're looking to deliver specific outcomes by specific periods of time. That then typically cascades down to an investment slate within the organisation, where they're saying these are the projects that we're going to run in order to achieve the objectives that we've put out in our strategy. So then my question to organisations is, to what extent have you understood those projects and the extent to which that data is either a dependency or an enabler to ensure that those strategic imperatives will be met, and therefore you'll be able to get your strategic outcome. And the organisations that don't do this often are the ones that quote data quality challenges as being a key challenge in the reason why they had a delay of a massive CRM platform or whatnot. A lot of what we talked about in that transformation space. So if you actually look at it through that lens, organisations prioritise their strategic investment slate on an annual basis, if not even more frequently. And then how do you go through those and prioritise which of those your data management program is going to sufficiently address? Now that's from the strategic perspective. You also will probably recall from one of the very early slides, and I'll just flick back to it right now, 2 seconds. This one right at the very start. Okay, this one here, where we talk about strategy and operational. So we just talked about the strategic change that's coming to an organisation. We need to make sure that our data strategy addresses the strategy, but we also need to make sure that it is dealing with the highest, most profiled operational or BAU issues and challenges that organisations are facing into here. So a great source for that is to understand what the key risks are that are on the agenda of the organisation. Frequently when I talk with risk professionals, they may have one data risk captured at a macro level for the organisation. But my question would be, well, how do you link that back to your information asset register where you've tied, these are the key critical business outcomes for the organisation, and these are the data sets that we've got, and this is the extent to which that we're confident that our most critical data is protected and fit for purpose for those activities, and therefore how can you prioritise the biggest issues and risks to face into from an organisational perspective as well. But either way, it should be either tied to business process through the operational lens or strategic value.
Thanks, John. The next question is from Rupa. So Rupa is asking, actually she has asked a couple of questions, but let's go with the first one. Organizations have a lot of data. From a critical data element perspective, usually a priority approach is used and a few hundreds of critical data elements are governed rigorously. Is this sufficient? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So what I would say to that is that you cannot govern everything. When you look at your policies within and standards within organizations, we need to make sure that our policies and standards relate to the relative criticality of that information. I would encourage you to look at first doing that assessment from a holistic perspective of the organization, and not just looking at it from a risk or risk reporting perspective, but you also look at it from what is our most important data from an operational outcome perspective. And then your investment and focus in that needs to come down to the criticality of that data to the organizational outcomes that you're trying to achieve. It's not too uncommon to have organisations having only 1 or 2 people allocated to data governance and management, because most of the responsibility sits in technology to deliver. That is not aligning the importance of good quality data to the outcomes of the organisation. So more investment would definitely be recommended in that type of context. I hope that answers the question.
So if I could just jump in quickly on John, so the way DAMA talks about identifying these critical data elements, and especially in the data architecture spaces when they sort of flesh them out, they've been working with the business, and you know how we in the methodology they're creating subject areas as sort of that first level in the architecture before you build your data models. Within each of those subject areas that an organization has, and they can be 12 to 20 of them, there's probably 15 to 20 key elements in each one of them. And that's sort of a rule of thumb to figure out how many I have to deal with.
Yeah, so I like that. And what I've done with a couple of organisations, actually, if we talk about, it's really interesting because you come at it from an information modelling perspective back into the organisation. And what I've been covering here is actually coming at it from a process perspective. Now, what happens is that those two things kind of meet in the middle. Now, what you can do when you're building your information asset registers within the organisation, you're starting off with your business processes and the critical data that's in that, you can then tag those against the data domains that you're referring to, and it allows you to get that bilateral view of criticality from a business process, or let's call it traceability, from a business processing and dependency perspective through into your data domains. And I'll take your observation as fact in this instance that you'll probably end up with a subset of 15 odd per area. It is fair to say that if you're collecting data, it's there for a purpose, right? The key thing here is making sure you understand that purpose. And one of the common problems or challenges we see is that organisations don't necessarily understand the full organisational use of an individual piece of data. And only when they've got issues do they really appreciate the criticality to each of the different processes across the organisation.
Absolutely. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm just going to come to the questions, which are one per person. So next is John. John is asking, outside of state government, are data assets registers widespread?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, it's actually mandated now in the context of financial services as well. So as of, I think it was July last year, with the introduction of a piece of regulation called CPS 234, any bank or life insurer or superannuation organisation or health insurer all now have the obligation to have an information asset register. And what we're also starting to see now with the proliferation of cyber incidents and threats and fixation on the ability to respond to those, that's now proliferating their use far and beyond just government and financial services as well. But it's not as well mandated in other areas.
Thanks, John. The next question is from Dean. So Dean is asking, what are some of the defensive, offensive data KPIs that are being tracked by the executives and the chief data officer? What is easy to measure and what is hard?
Okay, so, I'm a massive fan of understanding the strategic objectives, because if you go and pick up an organisation and they have a corporate plan, it will usually have some kind of quantifiable metric around performance. So if you're able to latch onto that and you're able to actually understand the extent to which the data is critical to that, then you're able to demonstrate and articulate how your efforts are able to or have helped the organisation achieve that business objective. So that's one set of KPIs within an organisation. The other set of KPIs is understanding your maturity or benchmarking of the rollout of your individual functions. Now, there's you guys, from a DAMA perspective, I know that there's historical focus on that. I know there's industry-specific maturity scales. There's another one by the name of DCAM, which is quite interesting as well. It doesn't really matter which maturity scale you choose, but if you make a specific objective to roll out something and then and you're rolling that out in the context of solving a business problem, it gives you two different types of KPIs that you can follow from a perspective. The other one that I'd introduce this is when we're talking about our operational as opposed to our strategic, is you can look at the symptoms of not getting it right. We talked about the operational effectiveness perspective, right? So one of my favorite ones is around straight through processing, or the number of exceptions of errors of things getting stuck in operational processes because data was not fit for purpose. So if you can identify those hotspots, again, you're linking it directly to the business value around how many problems you're solving within the organization.
Absolutely.
And
yeah, and you know, you have to embed it as part of the business process to realize the value.
Yeah.
Okay.
And definitely, sorry, just going to say that, and then the whole mystery about how do you actually calculate a KPI, and can everyone agree on the formula for coming up with that indicator value?
Yeah. Okay. Next question is from Jason. So Jason is asking, in your experience, how often are data management programs viewed internally within an organization as a once-off project versus the introduction of a business practice that is part of the BAU?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we need to make sure that there's a difference between data governance and data risk management, which are ongoing functions and obligations that organizations need to have in place. So when we look at it from a data governance perspective, the first question I ask is, well, what are you governing, right? If you're governing your data, what data, in what context are you governing it? And one of the key ways to do is to say, well, we're governing it in the concept of all of the obligations we've specified through our policies, and that's what I call the data risk management and compliance facet, which has got to be an ongoing capability aligned to your risk management processes. The other element is your data improvement program. And as we talked about earlier, if that is something that is being refreshed on an annual basis aligned to your business strategy and the strategic investment slate, you'll see that you actually have a continual focus on embedding good data management practices into the organization. The most complex thing then is figuring out what is the operating model that you're going to use to do that. Are you delivering data as a service to programs? Or are you providing standards and guidelines that those projects need to embed and the resources they need to embed to ensure that the agreed SDLCs are followed within the organisation? So it's not really a black and white answer to the question, but it's certainly not a one-off program. And if you actually look at many organisation strategy, they will say that data and analytics and insights are key strategic imperatives that need to be in place on an ongoing basis. And if they don't have the investment associated with that, you've got to question how they're going to be able to deliver on those promises.
Thanks, John. Last couple of questions. So Mark Benson is asking, who is it typically who owns the data strategy in an organization? Is it the CIO? And how successful are they typically in getting the sufficient buy-in from the board to truly deliver on the best practice that you have stepped us through tonight?
Wow, that's the best question to end the whole conversation. Look, I sit on the advisory board of another data management association known as the EDMC, and they conduct a biannual survey of organisations globally across industries. Now, through that, they actually asked a question to each of those organisations which were surveyed across all of these industries: who owns the data agenda within your organisation? Historically, we've seen, if we go back in time, a lot of data management agendas were driven by the CFO originally. I'm talking kind of decades ago, where there was a focus on making sure that the right data was available in GL to make sure that financial reporting was trustworthy and reliable. Then there was a big swing from the CFO to the CIO, where it became a bit of a technology agenda, and we saw data and analytics platforms spawning up in technology space. Whereas now we're seeing it being sponsored out of two key areas. The most prolific globally is actually the COO, or Chief Operating Officer, who is now starting to see the importance of good data management, particularly as they embark on automation agendas. And if they don't have good quality data, it's derailing their ability to deliver on that. But also with the advent of all of the cyber risk and privacy concerns and GDPR, we're seeing a lot of sponsorship of data management programs coming out of the CRO. So I apologise for my wry laugh at the start. It is different for every organisation based on the problems that they're facing into and their strategic agenda. I find that the most impactful programs are actually when you've got a co-sponsorship and buy-in across the C-suite, and you've actually developed a strategy that has understood the data priorities to each of the different agendas of that C-suite, and everybody has a vested interest in the outcome. And the more that you can tie your data management agenda into the benefits that you're going to deliver to each of those executives, the more likely you get the buy-in and success from an ongoing perspective.
So if I might just stick my nose in there one more time. So being a DAMA group, as we are, and following the BOK, and really, because it's that framework and the consistency of stuff, and recognizing that this chief data officer role that, you know, that's proposed to be the head of data management, data governance sort of capability within an organization, and saying to the CIO, God, I'm going to take this off your hands finally so you can concentrate on the applications and the technology with your chief technology officer or whatever to work about how it's working all out. But the chief data officer is going to be more responsible for the business recognition of the information, managing the glossary and the compliance and the standards and stuff. So is PwC actually pushing into organizations that this is a best practice pushed out by DAMA that should be considered?
So we don't typically tell organisations where they should sponsor their data management programs for. And what we'll find that even the vast majority of organisations at this point in time don't yet have a COO. And to your point,
a CDO.
Sorry, CDO. And to your point, if they do, they typically don't have a seat at the executive level. And so they report into someone in the organisation, whether it's the Chief Transformation Officer, the Chief Digital Officer, or the CIO. But we are also seeing it, depending on what business problems they're solving, being driven out of the CRO. I hold back from dictating to a client who should own it and who should sponsor it without understanding the agenda that they're trying to solve for. So if they're coming at it from a privacy and a regulation perspective, it can be driven out of one area. If it's coming from an operational challenge or transformation problem, then it can sit within different spaces. But I think the key thing that you're highlighting is that somebody needs to be accountable at the executive level, and that they need to make sure that whatever the agenda is, it doesn't just service the technology agenda, the operational agenda, or the finance agenda, or the risk agenda, or the transformation agenda, that they've taken a balanced approach in understanding what are their highest, biggest priorities for data management in the organisation. We've got a formalised and systematic planning in place and the right resourcing to set itself up for success.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks, John. And yeah, I agree completely that it depends on your line of business and the maturity at the organization. And I know there, we have run out of time. There are a few other questions. If you permit, John, I can request people to connect with you on LinkedIn, if that is fine with you.
Yeah, that's fine.
And carry on the conversation there, because this is a very important thing. More so in the world that we are living post-COVID, where you are going to require trust, and you have to balance the strategic drivers with the risks which are associated with it. So once again, thanks so much. Thanks, John, for giving this very, very interesting, and the knowledge was, there were pearls of wisdom everywhere. And thanks to the other panel members as well. And thanks to the attendees. Thank you so
Awesome.
much. And one last thing, everyone, we have DAMA membership. If you want to become the members of DAMA, you can visit our website. I had posted the link earlier. Have a wonderful day ahead and stay safe.
Thank you for the opportunity, guys.
Thanks, John.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.